Okay, so this is kind of an interesting talk, I think. I'm going to go through 14 slides. In some ways, this topic is quite mysterious, maybe to people here at this conference. You can hear me? And I welcome all questions. So I'll go through the 14 slides. They're fairly dense, but this topic needs to go through things fairly carefully to really understand what's going on in this problem. Lawyers make these things more complicated maybe than they need to be, and they get us into trouble many times because they don't necessarily work with technical people to figure out what's going on behind the scenes. So my job here, the way I see it, is to explain what is going on under the skin in this particular field of copyright infringement. So I'm going to be talking about copyright infringement. Hopefully this is moved up. Oh, it's not. Business. So what's this talk going to be about? It's going to be about legal issues to do with media. You want that? Media companies have launched all kinds of thousands, tens of thousands of legal suits against people stealing movies and lots of other content over the internet using BitTorrent. But BitTorrent is also a tool that's used day to day to do all kinds of things, including doing large scale distribution of software, distribution of games, lots of legal and legal movies, legal content. What I've done here is I've been working with in these cases, 12 of them over the last about 8 years, I guess. And I've collected various facts and data from certain products that are being used routinely to claim copyright infringement. So the foundational issues here are the monitoring software is software-based. So that's an essential problem that people in the court system seem to believe that software works correctly, right? It doesn't have faults, doesn't fail. The question really here in this problem here is software methods for controlling data collection. Is this software reliable enough? So that's the big question behind the scenes. Is it reliable enough to do the job? And are the methods that are being used reliable enough? So the methods for using the software, as you'll see, are speculative. The companies that produce these kinds of tools out there, some people call them copyright troll companies that work with the lawyers to try to accuse people of copyright infringement when they haven't actually, when there's no real evidence of copyright infringement. They refer to their tools as proprietary. So they don't really do anything much to reveal the tools or the software. So the software itself is kind of hidden from view. They refer to them as forensic, quote unquote. I got it in quotes. They call them reliable and accurate, but they're not commercially available. And there's lots of reasons to believe, and that's what I'm trying to do here, is expose those reasons to understand that this software is not really reliable and is not accurate. So that's my job today. What I'm going to do is describe how BitTorrent works. Anybody here know something about BitTorrent? Ever use it? Yeah, yeah. So you understand the basics, structure, system, architecture. So I'll say a little bit about it because I need to point to it to explain where the vulnerabilities are, or where the flaws really are, a better way, the defects. So I'll say something about BitTorrent monitoring tools. Have any of you any experience or used or seen these kind of tools? Unlikely, because they claim they're proprietary and they won't expose or reveal the software or the code very often. I've seen software in one case, and I've got some interesting stories we can share. there are critical deficiencies in the monitoring software and the methods. So I'm going to explain where those deficiencies are. I'm suggesting also in the paper, and there's more details in the paper, but I'm suggesting also certain ways of mitigating these problems. But not all the problems can be mitigated or resolved. So there's certain limitations in the problems that we have here that can't be overcome with the tools that are being used to claim that people have committed copyright infringement. So I've said something about it being used for legal sharing as well as illegal sharing. So copyrighted movies seem to be the most popular trolling vehicle that's being used out there right now because so many people are trying to share. Tens of thousands of people are sharing, maybe millions, we don't really know, are sharing copyrighted movies all over the world. And most of these issues seem to be in the United States and Canada, most of these kind of cases, quite a lot in Europe, and a lot of the tools, well, in fact, probably all the tools that are being promoted out here and used for accusing people of copyright infringement are originate from Germany. So anybody from Germany here? No, I know there are some German folks at the conference. These tools, if somebody's being wrongfully accused, well, it can be a very stressful experience. So lawyers and some lawyers I've worked with have been trying to defend people against copyright infringement with minimal evidence of real copyright infringement. And, there's lots of stories there. I haven't really communicated with the defendants closely myself, but I understand that there's a lot of stress, a lot of family issues that can get caused by being accused of copyright infringement and that kind of thing, damaged relationships, lost jobs even. And tools that I'm familiar with are called NARS, Maverick Monitor, VXN Scan. Those three tools seem to be related. They seem to be developed from open source software running on Unix-based systems. Excuse me. But there's no real hardcore evidence of where and how they evolved and come to being used for this kind of trolling of copyright infringement. The context here is that from a copyright infringement point of view, is if you translate the copyright tool in the context of BitTorrent, is that obtaining a complete substantial playable copy of a copyrighted movie would be infringement if you could show it. Or distributing a complete and substantial playable copy of a movie, copyrighted movie, would also be a case for copyright infringement. But we'll see this is hard, very hard, and is not being proven. Admissibility of technical evidence, you would think that Daubert, which is a famous case that you can look up, and I've referenced it in the paper, that you'd get sufficient. It basically says that for software to be used or technology to be used in court cases should be what? Should provide lots of facts and data. Should be tested empirically somehow. Peer-reviewed, maybe published at conferences like this, and accepted by the scientific community. But in these cases I'm looking at, none of this is true, right? But judges seem to just want to get rid of these cases, and they don't really spend a lot of time saying, okay, well, we'll give you a subpoena because you have a little bit of information that somebody using this IP address might have infringed, and we'll give you a subpoena. And then the subscriber gets accused of infringement and gets harassed by the lawyers that are acting on behalf of the companies that are doing this suing, these media companies. And they end up having being chased around, and that's where all the harm happens. So what I like to do is go through a chart to get a sense of the building blocks of BitTorrent. I know some of you know something about it, so I'll try not to belabor this. These building blocks include clients. So it's an agent-based system, right? So it's an agent-based system. The clients are pieces of software that are installed in your device for sharing content, or in this case, movies, digital content. These clients talk to each other using a BitTorrent protocol. So BitTorrent protocol has certain features and capabilities. I'll touch on them. I say something about them in the paper. The most popular clients are pretty well all open source. Not all of them, but most of them are open source tools like BitComet, these list here. The one that is most popular and the one that I'm most familiar with is muTorrent, which has actually, according to one source I've seen, 69% of the market. Well, that's a pretty big chunk. I don't know if it's entirely true, but it's a big chunk. And I've used qTorrent. Those are two tools I'm most familiar with, and I've done various kinds of tests with those tools. So BitTorrent shares content in the form of what's called a swarm, right? A swarm is simply a cloud within the internet that is sharing content that has a common hash code, they call it the info hash. So we'll see how the info hash fits in here. So this cloud that is sharing information, shares pieces of movies and pieces and small pieces. So you can have hundreds of pieces, maybe 1,000 pieces in a movie that get shared to possibly tens of thousands of people out there in the cloud, in the BitTorrent cloud. Seeders are the ones who hold the pieces of the movie. So the original seeder is the person, or perhaps you have multiple seeders that are conspiring to seed content into a BitTorrent cloud, into a BitTorrent swarm. So those guys, leaders, hold all the pieces and upload pieces to those folks that are in the cloud asking for pieces, right? And those people in the cloud who are those, we call those peers. So peers start holding no pieces, and they download pieces from seeders and peers in the swarm until completion, okay? If they get all the pieces. So there's lots of questions here. Well, is it possible that peers will always get all the pieces, right? The driving force behind this is called a torrent file. There's a new version of BitTorrent out there that's not getting a lot of traction. So I'm just describing the base case, the base configuration for BitTorrent. I'm not going to say anything. I say a little bit in the paper about this newer version. But anyway, a torrent file is created by the initial seeder or seeders that might create a copy of the same torrent file. Creates a torrent file for sharing the pieces. So this torrent file is an essential element of people being able to share content, i.e. digital movies. The torrent file includes the path of file and file name and file holding the movie, the media. The media is in a file. The media has a name. It's part of the torrent. It includes the size of the file. In other words, the size of the movie. How big a movie is this? Is it a few K? Or is it a few megabytes? Or is it maybe several gigabytes or maybe hundreds of gigabytes for high definition movies? The hash of, well, what you do, I guess my grammar isn't quite right, but you hash the hash of the torrent file yields metadata of the torrent file yields an info hash. So this is a SHA-1 hash that is created identifying the swarm sharing the movie. So the info hash is really an identifier for the swarm. So that's and you'll see this in the figure I lied about, I'm going to come up with in a second. So that info hash is a key element of how all this works and how seeders and peers share content on a peer-to-peer basis across a particular swarm. The initial seeder, or maybe seeders, posts torrent files on torrent sites. So that's where people can go and find them. So they'll go and find torrent files and say, well, that torrent file looks interesting. I'd like to get a copy of that. So I'll download the torrent file and I'll use the torrent file, including all of the piece hashes. I think I skipped over it. The file size, piece size, number of pieces in that the movie is chopped up in, fragmented into, and a piece hash for every piece. That's all included in the torrent file. Okay. And I mentioned the hash of the torrent file. It's a hash on the metadata only in the torrent file. So there's another element of this is that the BitTorrent file points off to the trackers that are out there. There's multiple trackers in the BitTorrent world that track what's going on and allow people to share information. And those people that share it need copies of the torrent file that is attached to the swarm identified by the info hash of the torrent file. I'm a little involved, but the diagram may make it clearer. What else here? The torrent trackers. These are trackers. These are announced in part of the definition of a torrent file, but it's not the part that creates the info hash. So the technical part that says, okay, this is a swarm over here that I want to go to and share pieces of information. That process, that info hash doesn't include the tracker. So you can update an info hash to add more trackers because that sometimes increases the ability to people find content. The seeders and peers provide their IP addresses to trackers for updating swarm directories. So every tracker has a directory in it for all the swarms, because we have many, many swarms, each identified by info hash. Seeders and peers provide their IP addresses when they are putting content into the swarm. Use those IP addresses, get them from the tracker so that they can share pieces with other IP addresses. So there's no identity here. People are sharing peer-to-peer, getting IP addresses from the trackers, using the .torrent files to figure out what to expect when getting pieces or looking for pieces. And they use the clients, the peer-to-peer protocol, BitTorrent protocol implemented in the clients to share content. Okay. Any questions here? No. Okay. So we get to the fun part, the sharing part. Sharing, completeness, and playability. These are issues. How do you share pieces and do it successfully? Because, there's failure modes on the internet. So if you have a failure mode of some kind, you may not get the pieces you're hoping for, and you may never be able to get a complete copy of the content. So the sharing constraints, BitTorrent clients do not authenticate users. So that makes an interesting problem for the lawyers because they'd like to be able to identify who's actually infringing. So they can't crack into a site somewhere where you've logged in and you have maybe your email address that may partially identify you, and to figure out who you are. You might be sharing content, maybe you're sharing illegally, but it's very hard for them to figure out who you are because all they have is your IP address, and internet service providers change your IP addresses on an ongoing basis. In fact, you can change it simply by plugging and restarting your router in your home or in your office. So what else? Other important factors here. Clients can throttle uploading pieces into .torrent file. So you can set whatever open source BitTorrent client you're using, you can throttle how much goes in, how much you upload. You might try to turn it off entirely, right? And those people, those peers who don't upload, but want to collect information, like if you're a peer, you just want to get a copy of a movie. You don't want to share anything you have with anybody else. Well, you can try to throttle it, but BitTorrent is designed to allow peers to share pieces with other peers, but the person owning the peer, the owner who has the client that's doing this, even though they can throttle it, they might not be able to close it off because it'll depend on the version of the BitTorrent client they're using. So that's an important factor here, this idea of leeching. So leechers are people who are peers who want content but aren't willing to give any. BitTorrent protocol has something called choking, has a protocol element which is launched when automatically, which is launched by a client. If when they send pieces, they don't get any pieces back, then I'm going to choke you. I'm not going to ask any for pieces from you anymore. I'm going to go to other people that are around. So they'll go to other peers because I have this list of IP addresses. I'll try some of these other folks. And so leeching peers is an important element, and you'll see why in a second. So this is just kind of saying that the BitTorrent protocol has some obvious things and some less obvious things running behind the scenes. So there's a handshake. So I have an IP address. Do a handshake. We don't really know each other. The system doesn't identify who we are. And but once we do the handshaking and we say, oh, this is the info hash of the swarm that I'm looking for, I'm trying to get pieces from the swarm, then I'll say, oh, I'm interested in getting pieces from it. Or I can say, I have pieces that you might be interested in. And so all this is happening under the skin. So the protocol just implements this automatically. So have an interested interplays happen, protocol exchanges, and then the piece data is moved. So out of this tiny fragment of the movie, I'll give you this piece, and then maybe I'll give you a few more pieces if you're good, and you give me some pieces back. But it's all automated. It's under the skin. And if you look at the timeline, the other factor here is that pieces are received randomly, more or less randomly. There's things you can do to make it a little less random. Like I want to get all the pieces at the beginning, maybe all the pieces at the end. But generally speaking, when I'm looking for pieces, they're coming in randomly. And so I have a movie timeline where I have lots of gaps, especially if I have a several hundred piece fragmented movie into maybe 100, 200, 1,000 pieces. But over time, these gaps gradually fill in. Okay. And each time I receive a piece, I'm checking the info hash. I'm computing, or at least the client is doing this. I don't really know what's happening, right? The client computes the hash of the piece, looks in the torrent file, compares it to the hash in the torrent file, and if they match, it says, oh, this piece is good. Okay. If it doesn't, then it'll try to get that piece from that same person again, or try somebody else. So the gaps are gradually filled in. We have this handshaking, we have this verification, validation process happening. And eventually, hopefully, the person will get all the pieces. And hopefully they don't have somebody accusing them of copyright infringement. So they got these two kind of dimensions. And they probably use VPNs to try to hide behind, right? And in fact, seeders in this BitTorrent world will, I think, almost always use VPN services, right? Because if they're seeding, possibly they're first seeders that have stolen the content and have fed it, illegally acquired it somehow You can imagine in Seinfeld, Kramer, remember when he had his handicap and handy cam and he videoed some movies and something, figured he'd make a lot of money. So anyway, that's kind of a funny example of stealing content and then putting it out potentially on a BitTorrent network. Oh, I didn't mention that one thing there. So peers obtaining all the pieces in swarm can begin to seed, or they can just leave, right? So if a seeder gets all the pieces, said, "Oh, I want to contribute back. I'm not worried about copyright infringement trolls. I'm going to just feed something. They're not going to discover my IP address and who I really am, right? So I'll just keep feeding content back, even though I know that this content is copyright protected. Now, if it's not copyright protected, I probably don't think of all those issues. I think of some of them maybe. So 3 points here. BitTorrent does not guarantee peers will obtain complete playable copies of movies, right? Doesn't guarantee it because you have to get all the pieces and then the client has to assemble those pieces into something that's playable. Clients may not be able to assemble them into playable content. They might, some clients implement a strategy where they pre-allocate the space and then they fill in all the spaces on disk, on your disk drive, or in memory, depending on how much memory you have. And then they move ahead. And they'll get a complete copy that way. Anyway, there's no guarantee the torrent metadata file or the file names characterize the real media. So that means that if you go to a torrent site and look at some files you think you want to share and the names look interesting, they might not actually match the content. You might download through a swarm content that doesn't actually match the content, the movie that you're expecting to get. And I mentioned virtual VPNs could be used to hide your tracks. And I'm sure that seeders would hide their tracks. But peers, before becoming seeders, may not be thinking about hiding their tracks, maybe until they get to become seeders or they decide not to seed, right? So, and their relationship with the BitTorrent swarm. So here's a figure that animates what's going on here. So you have an initial seeder. It's a little bit out of focus on that. Now this is a fairly busy slide, so I'm hoping you can see it. The initial seeder, I'm calling the initial seeder S0, acquires a movie, maybe illegally. The example I'm using here is a 48-minute or so playtime movie, 397 megabytes. That's not a huge movie. It's not a full-featured 4K movie that you'd be stealing from a movie house, right? What happens next is that the client says, "Okay, I'll chop this up. I want to seed it into the world, so I need to create a .torrent file. I'm calling this movie M to just sort of as a reference point. So there's an arbitrary movie M, fragmented, in this case, 758 half meg movies. That's, I think, half a megabyte in binary. The torrent file includes the name, size, number of pieces, piece size, and all the pieces. So in this case, we got 758 piece hashes, and this isn't really that big a movie, right? That's posted on the torrent site. The torrent sites have copies of the .torrent file, .torrent M, I'm calling it for this movie. Oops. Okay, at some point in time, the client says, "Okay, I'm ready to activate, or I'll distribute or seed, ready to seed into BitTorrent. So I'm calling this swarm M the info hash. the swarm is identified by the info hash. I'm going to start seeding content, and I'm going to give the info hash and my IP address. IP0 as represents the seeder's IP address. I send that to the BitTorrent tracker, creates a directory, and all people who want to share content, all peers who want to share content, or additional seeders who may have exactly the same .torrent file, would then use that directory to coordinate their activities. So in this example here, now I've shown, it's a very simple example, but I've shown P1, P2, P3 interested in sharing content. They go to the torrent sites and get a copy of torrent file that they think is interesting, and they share it. And they use it to do the sharing. And then over time, they provide their info hash. IPX represents an arbitrary user who wants, a client user who wants to get copies of the movies, download it. So they'll get the IP addresses for the swarm from the tracker. So tracker just says, okay, I'll just keep track of who's interested in content that's in this swarm. And if new people come in, new peers come in, I'll put those into the same directory. And anybody can go to the tracker and say, oh, give me the IP addresses sharing this content. I think there's a limit around 50 IP addresses at a time that a client can download and then start using those IP addresses to share content. They might not need 50, but in this case, they would need to get pieces. If they all got one piece per IP address, then they'd have to be downloading, 758 IP addresses, but it's usually less than that. Emulates the notion that, we have an active swarm here, probably hundreds of thousands of peers and some seeders sharing content. I'm showing only one seeder at this stage. And then I'm showing a client down here. This represents an arbitrary client, IPX, some client, call them X. And I call it X because I tried to show here, I tried to show P10, P9, P4, P1, talking about them in that order, because this client here is busy trying to get pieces of the movie shared in the swarm. And then this here shows sort of emulates this idea of receiving pieces. So initially some PX says, oh, I have no pieces. So peer X and IPX are after each other, okay? So this client is saying, oh, I have no pieces initially. And then I start asking for pieces. I go to the tracker. I make sure I have to have a copy of the .torrent file, right? I mentioned that. So I have the .torrent M. I can end up finding the swarm, and then I can start getting pieces because I got the IP addresses of people that are sharing this content. So eventually, they're showing how the timeline gets filled in. Eventually, I get all the pieces, and they're all verified. And if I do that, then I should be able to assemble and render a complete playable movie that's an exact copy of the initially seeded movie. It'll be exact because all the piece hashes need to be checked. So every piece that the movie is chopped up into has a piece hash, and those piece hashes are checked against the pieces that actually come in. So you compute the hash on each piece, compare it to the hash and the .torrent file, and you say that's good. Eventually, you'll get all the pieces. Now, and this is just showing that eventually peers that get all the pieces can become seeders. So I tried to illustrate or animate that. So P1 and P2 become seeders. Now, if we go to the monitoring model, BitTorrent swarms are monitored. How are we doing on time?
Yeah. 10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay. So the BitTorrent swarms monitoring, they first target swarms that they think are sharing a movie. They don't really know. You kind of look at them, the name looks right. That's Godfather 5 or whatever. And I'm going to I think I'd like to get a copy of that. But the trouble is there's no evidence that they've actually done that. No, this is claimed by plaintiffs that they're targeting swarms that contain the copyrighted content. And the monitoring part, download pieces, upload. So the monitoring tools are leechers. They don't contribute. They only hoard, right? They're only grabbing whatever pieces come their way. And then they're reporting those people as having infringed copyright. They may not have very many pieces. The protocol captures, so these tools claim to capture the protocols, okay? The transactions, they're really transaction oriented. They're capturing all the transactions, they record the date and time, the IP addresses from which they came, and the pieces that were exchanged, okay? So if you go into the protocol capture file, you can say, oh, this is when this happened, this is where the piece came from, and I look at the pieces exchanged, and I could actually compute the piece hashes. If I don't trust the code, that's actually the code that's embedded, I can actually check the piece hashes, and I can give that to a defendant, say, okay, here are the piece hashes, and the defendant can say, okay, I'll write a script, or I'll have somebody write a script to check if the piece hashes are all correct. And I'll count up how many pieces I have and where they came from, right? So, okay. So, swarms that I've given files, search for swarms. We don't have complete information. We say, well, we think this is a swarm. This is a dot we want to use to track IP peers who are sharing content in the swarm. And then the critical issues here are the PCAPs. No PCAPs are reported when they're part of the swarm. But they don't really know for sure, or they can't prove that they know for sure. All they can do is assert that this swarm contains shared copyright material. In the monitoring stage, so once they say, oh, we'll target the swarm, because they get to get the target a swarm, they'll download client, download all the pieces. They can from different IP addresses. And then when they start monitoring, they start watching individual peers and their IP addresses to see how many pieces they have. If they collected all the pieces, then they can claim they infringe copyright. So the critical issues here are that the targeting doesn't use PCAPs. So the transaction data is not available. You can't really check the transaction data. If it's given to you, you have a complete movie, for example, and during monitoring, they only capture about 3.3% of the movie. So that's a pretty small fraction, and 9 seconds of playtime. You say, oh, that's enough. And the other point here was leaching. They don't forget leaching. So the protocol will go in here. So and then you might not be able to get the pieces here. So this figure sort of shows now the previous figure with the BitTorrent monitoring software. It's looking for swarms. It has a copyrighted movie. It's kind of copyrighted movies that would be shared over BitTorrent swarms. So it'll get the info hash, the tracker will set up a directory, and it'll get IP addresses. And then it'll target those IP addresses individually. So let's try to illustrate that monitoring software is finding out pieces from the peers that are in the network. monitoring software is leaching, swarm searched. We're not recording PCAPs. The transaction evidence is very low. Only 2 or 3 pieces are collected from each IP address. Yet they're being accused of infringing. So this diagram illustrates the idea of a seeder network, number of users. One of the speculative parts of this approach that they're implementing and forcing on people and harassing people with includes shared routers or shared PCs. Here's a shared PC. A subscriber on the router, other people, maybe neighbors or family members sharing the router. And the IP addresses on this side of the router, for example, are private. So you can't discover those easily. You might be able to through some kind of forensics process, but that's very hard to do. So in the public network, finding which address this person is using, who might be the subscriber, is very hard to do. So we have in this example that our monitor collecting data from this swarm, gets enough data to claim that they got a full copy. Okay, but they don't have PCAP data, which is this transactional data. They don't have that data to prove that this full copy was actually captured. When there was a capture, did you capture the whole copy? Where did it come from? Might just be a copy of the copyrighted movie. So you don't know. But they're saying, well, we captured it from this swarm and it matches the copyrighted movie. So there's some holes in their logic. And then, of course, they're busy here with a few pieces of reporting infringement. That's where the harassment starts. The big issue in my mind is that this whole blob here, the monitor, is highly speculative and has unproven software. We don't know whether the software is reliable. And on top of that, it speculates about IP addresses that are targeted and whether those IP addresses will experience failures. So there's various failures that can happen that are undetected. So these failure modes are unresolved, undetected. So piece availability. Are there enough pieces in the swarm to actually get a complete copy that's playable? Has somebody decided to get out? No, they're abandoning the demo mode. They're not interested anymore. They waited too long. They waited all night, never got the movie. There's all other kinds of software failures that we don't know about because all these are open source tools. None of them are verified. Many have no control over how reliable they are. And there's a problem of space depletion. So they may not be able to accept big movies. They may just crap out. But the biggest problems here are probably that choking failures. So I think it's very likely that these monitoring tools can't collect that many pieces, right? Because they get choked. And they could be monitoring failures also that prevent them from getting pieces because we don't know how reliable the software is. So this means that there's a lot of false reporting of people that experience unavailability, abandonment, space depletion, or the tool itself, monitoring will fail, and none of those failures are resolved. So it's no wonder they only collect 0.3% or 2 or 3 pieces and claim that they're infringing. So in the paper, I've got what, 2 minutes?
Yeah, you know, I was wrong. You're good. You've got 15 minutes.
I do. Yeah. Oh, I can slow down. All right. Okay, so in my closing remarks, now I can go slower. The closing remarks, I've divided it up into 3 parts. BitTorrent monitoring tools as is. So these problems, I'm summarizing the problems in the current situation, the as is situation. okay, with these tools. I'm looking at what's the goal? Well, can some of these problems be resolved with better software engineering? And then there's the unresolved limitations. So I'll talk about these three things. So I'm saying the as is highly speculative. And the software is homebrewed. You know, I have no idea how reliable the software is or accurate it is. And so this table I'm going to lay out here is a summary of all those issues I brought up. I hope most of them at least. The quality of evidence. So in the end, the burden of proof is on the plaintiff to say, well, we have enough evidence gathered from this great tool of ours that's not commercially available, and we think it's reliable. And it's going to be the argument from the plaintiff's point of view. The defendant, meanwhile, has to point out, well, no, there's a lot of unreliability here. There's a lot of speculation going on here. And you have to convince the judge about that. So there's the efficacy of the methodology. Well, it's speculative because, why? Because failure modes, it assumes failure modes do not occur, but they do. We know they occur, we just don't know how many, right? Collecting a few pieces is enough. Well, that collecting a few pieces is not enough. We don't know where the pieces came from. The targeting process didn't track the transaction and say, oh, you don't have any evidence. You're actually tracking pieces of a copyrighted movie. Three or four pieces, or 2 or 3 pieces, are not enough. They're not displayable. You can't play them, right? Identifying infringements. So are we identifying infringements reliably and accurately when we use one of these tools? Well, it's homebrewed, undefined process, technical specs don't exist, software is not very verifiably reliable. We don't have to go into the guts of that. But as quality engineers, we kind of know that, right? And we could discuss that further if we really felt there was a need. And then the big thing is adequacy of testing in QA. So the experts from these cases have often presented, well, you know, we've done all this testing, it works. But the examples they use that they describe, and they don't really give us a chance to look at, IP sharing is not configured. So they're not using shared routers or shared PCs, right? They're not in those test cases. It's not heavily loaded. So they're not running hundreds, thousands. They're doing unloaded, totally unloaded examples of ability to download. So it works as long as it's really totally unloaded. None of those failure modes I described is dealt with, right? No, okay, we assume they don't exist. And feature length movies are never tested. So the cases they present tested short YouTube videos, or maybe at most 45-minute video, but not high def feature length movie. Targeting swarms, we already hit on that one, I think. There's no transaction data. So how do we know that swarm that you're targeting has really content that's been infringing the copyrighted movie? And the critical failure mode resolution, well, that's just essential design flaw. They haven't even thought about the problem. Well, you could have somebody unplug the machine, what happens, you know, that kind of thing. So abandoned downloads, etc., are not dealt with. And infringement evidence sufficiency. Well, they have PCAP data. Sure enough, that's great. But if you only have PCAP data, transaction data for 2 or 3 pieces of a 700 piece movie, or maybe one that's 2 or 3,000 piece movie, then what is that? That's unplayable, unviewable, and that's not copyright infringement. And then playability and management, that's sort of, I already touched on it, I guess, but the content is so sparse that it can't be played. So how is that proved? So if I go into a court, if if the plaintiff says, okay, we're going to court, well, okay, show me how this piece, and where did the pieces come from, et cetera. And you have the case dealt with. But most of the time, they're harassing people so much that they settle out of court. Okay, I'll give you $5,000. That's what's happening. So we need to have, if you're really going to get into the business of chasing after copyright infringement, folks, you need a definitive and verifiably reliable monitoring solution. The software has to be verifiably reliable, at least through testing. And you need to have something that is not speculative, doesn't speculate that, oh, I've got. Speculating is, well, it won't fail. No, I'm just going to assert this. No, I'm not going to deal with a failure. No. Okay, so if I go through the same headings, you'll see that we want to have something that's definitive. Okay, collect all the pieces from the IP address, does a few things, and overcomes the failure modes. Because if any of those failures occur, well, you haven't captured enough data, and you have to toss that IP address aside. No, there's no evidence that they are infringing. Software reliability, no, give me some evidence that your software is reliable. Well, we could do something that's more oriented towards looking at the forensic purpose, getting some technical specifications, and producing software that is peer reviewable and testable. Right, then you might claim, okay, this software seems pretty good. It might not be perfect, might not be something you'd fly to the moon with, but it might be good enough for this kind of application. And robust testing, including a configuration that matches people. Most people share routers. Typical loads are often hundreds and thousands of people trying to get the copies of these movies. The failure modes, well, collect all the pieces, then you can ignore the failure modes. You don't have to worry about them. And then repeatability and reproducibility. Well, let's at least do that. Let's do enough testing to know that we can get complete copies of movies from IP addresses that are heavily loaded, right? From a swarm or from multiple swarms. Different versions of a movie, for example, you have different versions of a movie that are actually being shared on different swarms, because the person like Kramer is not going to be in the same swarm as somebody who got a master copy from the production house. You know, so they're going to be in different swarms. Critical failure modes. Well, if you capture all the pieces, then you're going to overcome these problems. You won't have as many people to harass, right? And then sufficient evidence, well, validate the monitoring. Well, you should validate the data. The transaction data should be used to validate all the pieces you collect, make sure they came from the right IP addresses, from the same IP address in each case, from the same swarm, matched, and the piece hashes all match what's in the torrent file. If you can do all that, you have a much better solution. Like, you can at least say, well, I've got a few instances of people infringing from IP addresses, right? And I can audio visually match it and prove to the justice that yes, this is copyright infringement. Limitations. Last slide. The shared routers hide the private information of public, so we already kind of talked about that. So those limitations are very hard to overcome. And personal devices can also be shared, and they'll be sharing the same IP addresses at any given time. So that's hard to overcome. Choking, well, no question that this tool, these monitoring tools, will choke. You won't be able to get all the pieces from a given peer. Well, we done. The last one is only available to collect a few pieces from a given peer's IP. So that sort of getting at that last bullet is getting at the fact that okay, you're choking me, you BitTorrent monitor. I don't know who you are, but I think you're somebody that I think is trying to share content with me. You're not giving me anything back, so I'm gonna talk to other people. I'm gonna collaborate peer-to-peer with other people. Well, it's a software talking underneath the skin. The actual user is not controlling any of that. That's all automated underneath the skin. Okay, so that's me. So we got any time left?
You have 3 minutes for questions.
3 minutes for questions. Yeah.